Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth session of the conference, A Modern Teaching Profession, Compensation, Preparation, Representation, and Evaluation, sponsored by the Harvard Program on Education Policy and Governance here at Harvard University. I'm Antonio Wendland and I serve as the Associate Director of this program. Before we start, just a quick few things about logistics and house cleaning. This is a Zoom webinar and it's being recorded, so everything you say will be part of the record. We will post these, as we have with previous sessions, on our website. We do have the opportunity to allow you to have your questions answered by our panel. To do so, please write your questions in the Q&A panel for us, and we will try to get to as many as we can. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce the program's director, Professor Paul Peterson, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government here at Harvard University. Paul?
Thank you, Antonio. Welcome everyone to the fifth session of our conference on the modern teaching profession. Today, we're going to examine the role of teacher unions in American education. There are two major unions, the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. They have won collective bargaining rights in over 30 states. Together, they represent 2 out of every 3 teachers. But court decisions, changing state laws, and the COVID pandemic have altered the landscape for teacher unions and for school politics. How does teacher representation in the collective bargaining process work today? How has it affected district policy over the years? How has it impacted student learning? What's the future? To discuss these issues, we have 3 distinguished panelists. They will be introduced by our co-moderator, Michael Hartney. He's a professor of political science at Boston College and a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's an expert on teacher unions and the collective bargaining process. Michael.
Thank you, Paul. Our first speaker today will be Michael Lovenheim. Michael's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of economics, public policy, and industrial and labor relations at Cornell University. Then we'll hear from Mimi Arnold-Lyon. She's an assistant professor of public policy at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs at the University of Albany. And her research focuses on the political economy of education, teacher unionization, labor markets, and education governance. And last, but certainly not least, we're pleased to be joined by Kira Orange-Jones. Kira is the CEO of TeachPlus, and their mission is to create new pathways for authentic teacher leadership that can help transform the nation's schools. And I should also mention that Kira served as an elected member of the Louisiana State Board of Education for over a decade. And with that, I will turn things over to Mike.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having me. I can share my slides now and go, I presume. Okay, wonderful. Everyone see that? Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about the effect of and what we know about the effect of teachers' unions and collective bargaining on student learning. And so I'm going to talk about this kind of broadly and then focus a bit on one of my papers that looks at this question. So the motivation for this, as Paul led with, is that teachers' unions are one of the most prominent features of teacher labor markets in the United States, with about 60% of teachers being covered in some way, shape, or form by a unionized, collectively bargained contract. So the central activity of unions is collective bargaining. And just to kind of set ideas, collective bargaining is the process by which a union negotiates a labor contract with an employer. And for teachers, this is their employer is the school district. Unlike the private sector, public employee collective bargaining is determined by state law rather than the federal government. And among these state laws, the key law that I focus on and that the literature focuses on are these what's called these duty to bargain laws, which create a duty for employers to bargain with elected unions in good faith. Currently, 33 states have these duty to bargain laws. So among those that don't, collective bargaining's prohibited in several states. And then in several other states, there's just no law at all, which generates kind of no real collective bargaining. The remaining states that don't have duty to bargain laws allow collective bargaining, but don't mandate that employers negotiate. And this is what one union official described to me as collective begging. Right, so kind of illustrates that these laws are very important, these duty to bargain laws, in inducing actual negotiation between unions and employers. So that's what we're going to focus on. So there's a kind of very interesting history that I'm happy to talk about if there are questions about it, about why these laws arose and the kind of political economy behind the passage of these laws. But in general, they started to be passed in the 1960s due to strong lobbying by teachers and generally a pro-union public opinion and sentiment. And so states started passing these beginning with Wisconsin in 1960. And the whole idea here is that they facilitate this collective bargaining. And so teachers elect a union, and as Paul said, the NEA or AFT is typically the overarching union, to represent them in collective bargaining. And they bargain over a wide range of things, right? So of course, wages, but also non-wage compensation, promotion policies, work rules, including work hours, non-teaching duties, class assignments. So there's a wide range of things they can bargain over. And this range actually creates difficulty in understanding what exactly it is that unions are doing and what the collective bargaining process is generating. So this is just the distribution of when these laws were passed. So as I said, the first one was passed in 1960 and the last one in 1985, which was Ohio. And there's just a wide range of timing of when these laws were passed, which, if you for anyone in a given birth cohort, it creates variation in how long or whether they were exposed to collective bargaining while they were in their childhood years or in their schooling years. And that's what we're going to look at in this paper that I'm going to talk about in a minute. All right, but before I launch into the empirical stuff, I think it's important to just kind of think about, how might duty to bargain laws and collective bargaining affect students. And the key here is that the theoretical issues are quite ambiguous, which underscores the need for good empirical work. Fundamentally, these laws affect students by increasing the rate and substance of bargaining between teachers and school districts. And these are kind of happening through three main channels. Is they can alter the inputs to education, right? Changing how much you spend on teachers and books and facilities. They can affect teacher effort and thus productivity. And they can also change who becomes a teacher, right? By changing the quality of the working environment. It can change who decides to go into teaching or leave teaching. So why might the effects be positive, right? And there's several arguments that suggest that you could see a positive effect. A big argument here is what's called the union voice effect, which is that giving workers a voice with which to impact their workplace might make them more productive and attract better workers. Right. And there's also this idea that empowering teachers who are kind of on the front lines of education in the classroom could lead to better allocations of resources than we have otherwise, right? We don't know what the best allocation of resources is. And so empowering people who are kind of in the mix, right, who are engaged in the educational process on a day-to-day level might lead to better resource allocation. Unions advocate for more spending, which could raise achievement, and it also could be that raising teacher compensation could attract better teachers in the long run. On the negative side, the main argument comes from what in a seminal paper by Caroline Hawksby, who's a professor at Stanford, which calls the rent-seeking hypothesis, which is the idea that unions increase the resources going to teachers while also reducing the returns to those resources, right? So basically shifting resources towards teachers, but reducing the effect of those resources by eliminating the ability to really fire lower performing teachers and kind of delinking any relationship between performance and pay. As well, flatter pay scales might reduce the return to skill in teaching and could lead to lower skilled workers to sort into teaching, right? As we've seen in the US economy, the return to skill in the labor market's grown dramatically. And so if you have a flat teacher pay scale, really high skilled people are giving up increasing amounts of money to go into teaching, right? And that could adversely affect the quality of the teacher workforce. And so ultimately, right, the theory is not clear. And this is why we need to bring in empirical research to understand the question of how teachers, unions, and collective bargaining are affecting student outcomes. And so I have a paper with an outstanding former student of mine, Alex Willen, that's published in the American Economic Journal, Economic Policy in 2019, where we argue some of the clearest evidence to date on how teacher collective bargaining affects long-run outcomes of students. And there's kind of two major challenges to doing this kind of work. You might say, like, why don't we just know the answer to this, right? These unions have been around a long time. It seems like we should know. And there's kind of two big issues. And the first is a selection problem, we call selection, which is that teachers select into collective bargaining, right? So the districts that engage in collective bargaining and the states that have duty to bargain laws are just fundamentally different from the ones that don't, in ways that also are going to lead to differences in student outcomes, right? So we just can't compare the places that collectively bargain to those that don't. And so, okay, well, why don't we use changes in collective bargaining laws, these duty to bargain laws, to examine how, when these duty to bargain laws are passed, how outcomes change among the students affected versus those who are unaffected because they live in states that don't pass those laws. And the answer is that that's really hard to do because this happened a long time ago. We don't have good data from this time period, right? And so the way we address this problem is by using American Community Survey data, which is functionally like the US Census. And we're looking at kind of current outcomes of adults, but we can link them back to where and when they were born in the ACS and examine how people, because of where and when they were born, they were exposed to different collective bargaining laws for different periods of time, and linking that to current labor market outcomes, so long run effects. So the key approach here is a difference in difference approach, which basically we examine how outcomes change among treated groups relative to changes in a control group, right? So it's very, this might kind of make a lot of sense from seeing other social science research. And so the control group here allows you to account for other things that are happening at the same time, right? So growing up in the 1960s and 1970s, might have had independent effects on people, right? And we want to net out those independent effects. And so the way we're going to do that is using the states where there were no duty to bargain laws. And so we're going to examine how outcomes changed among students that were exposed to duty to bargain laws for different periods of time during their schooling years, relative to students who were not exposed at all because they were born in states that didn't pass these laws. And so these are the main findings. These are event studies. And so the way to interpret this is the negative relative time, or these are people born before these laws were passed. And the key way to look at this is that if you look at male earnings in panel A, prior to these laws being passed, outcomes were kind of trending similarly in states that did and did not pass these laws, right? So they were similar, the states that passed them and didn't. And then in time zero is like the state passes the law. And then you can see over time, so the positive relative time is, you can think of as the number of years a student would be exposed. So one would be exposed for 1 year because I was 17 when the law was passed. What you can see is over time, as students are exposed for more periods of time, male earnings in particular decline substantially, male hours work decline substantially, and there's no real effect on female earnings. And so to summarize these results briefly, the results suggest that teacher collective bargaining has a negative effect on male students in particular. Men earn about 4% less, work 1% fewer hours, are 1% less likely to be employed. They complete fewer hours of education and sort into lower skilled occupations. This is a huge effect when you aggregate it all up. It leads to about $214 billion in lost earnings per year from exposure to duty to bargain laws. And we also find that effects are larger for Black and Hispanic students, suggesting that increases in inequality. And we think this is really driven by the fact that the cities were the earliest to unionize, and in many ways had the strongest unions and the strongest negotiating experiences, and that's where Black and Hispanic students are more likely to reside. These effects on earnings seem most easily explained by reductions to education quality. So we do see reductions in educational attainment, but they're just not large enough to really explain this effect. And then we go to the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, where we have non-cognitive skills, non-cognitive skill measures, which have been shown in a lot of research to strongly affect long-run labor outcomes. And we see negative effects of collective bargaining on those. So I'm basically out of time. I'll just say that this aligns with several other papers, which I'm happy to talk about later if there are questions on the role of collective bargaining and on teacher strikes, which I know Mimi will talk a bit about more. So let me just briefly talk about the policy implications. One might say, okay, you see this research and you say we should eliminate teacher collective bargaining. And I think that's probably a strong reaction to this research. I think, the way I think about this from a policy perspective is kind of aligned with what's happening from a policy perspective in many states, which is that most recent law changes are aimed at kind of reducing the scope of collective bargaining, but aren't eliminating it, right? And so, the main question I have coming out of this is, how might we change the scope of collective bargaining and the nature of collective bargaining to protect students from what seems like rather adverse effects, particularly male students, while still providing teachers with a lot of the benefits that they value from the collective bargaining process. And I think that's a really important part of where this research needs to go in the future. All right, I'll end there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Mimi, we'll give you a second to share your slides.
Okay, can everyone see my slides? Thank you, Mike, for teaming me up, and also thank you, Michael and Paul, for having me. I'm going to be talking about some big picture work on the teacher profession, specifically focusing on some of that work in relation to unionization, and then also about teacher strikes and teacher voice in policy making and politics. So we've heard a lot about teacher strikes and teacher shortages during and because of the pandemic, and in particular, the big red thread teacher strikes that occurred in 2018 and 2019 and beyond. And we've really wondered, is this a right now issue, or has this been building for a long time? And I think the question here really matters, because if it's a right now issue, then we're less concerned, because as we evolve in response to sort of the acute events that set these teacher strikes in 2018 and 2019 and the pandemic off, then the issues might just resolve themselves over time. But if it's something bigger, something that was building before the strikes and before the pandemic, then it's going to take a more structural response. And so my colleague Matt Kraft at Brown and I endeavored to understand this by tracing the status of the teaching profession over the past half century. And in a recent working paper, we bring together over 30 different data sources to sort of trace the life cycle of the teaching profession. So an individual starts with existing in society, and we look at prestige and societal respect for teaching. And then a student might express an interest in becoming a teacher. Then they would need to actually take steps to prepare, so studying education or getting a license in education. And then we also look at satisfaction. Once someone is on the job, are they satisfied with the teaching profession? And we find compelling evidence of three major periods of change in the status of the profession across the last half century. I'm not going to be able to show you all 30 plus of our different figures that we have in the working paper, but this one is a good example that shows you the trends that we observed over time that are really remarkably consistent across prestige, interest, teacher preparation, and satisfaction. So here I'm showing you student interest in teaching. This is coming from the CURP survey, which is a cooperative institutional research program from Harry. And what we see is a pretty rapid decline in the percent of college freshmen that say that they want to become teachers or they expect to become teachers, then followed by a pretty swift rise in the early to mid 80s, then stability for the next 20 or so years, and then we see a rapid decline in interest in teaching since 2010. And again, this is really remarkably consistent across prestige, student interest, teacher preparation, and satisfaction. And what we're seeing is that right now, essentially, our most recent data is essentially indicative that we are at the lowest point in the state of the teaching profession over the past 50 years. And that this is not something that's driven by COVID entirely, because a lot of the trends that we're seeing started well before the pandemic. And so bringing it together, the state of the profession is really at a low point. So prestige fell between 20 and 47% in the last 10 years. Student interest fell by half since the 1990s. We have 100,000 fewer teachers per year that are getting certified relative to a decade ago, and satisfaction is at an all-time low. And this is not just a pandemic thing. This is something that's indicative of long-standing structural issues with the profession. So we really need more research to get at cause and effect. And we hope that our study is a launching off point for others. We do start to explore some hypotheses based on prior literature and some new data that can be teased apart at more micro levels to really get at cause and effect. So here we're just doing some exploratory work looking, essentially doing eyeball tests on 9 different hypotheses with 18 additional data sources that we use. And I'm not going to be able to show all of those today, but overall what we see is that the causes are most likely multifaceted and dynamic over time. There's no smoking gun, and also improving the status of the profession is probably going to be a generational task. So here I'm showing some data for the hypothesis that stagnant teacher pay made the profession less attractive. And of the 9 professions, this one really tracks the most with the consistent trends that we observe in the state of the profession. So this is showing average teacher salary and real wages since 1970. And you can see that similar fall in the 70s, rise in the 80s, consistent for the next 20 or so years, and then a decline starting in 2010, which goes even lower more recently with inflation. And another hypothesis, which is really related to the conversation today, is whether or not unionization might affect teacher prestige. And this is complicated because it could really go either way. So professionalism might decline because of the association between labor and blue collar work. Or on the other side, prestige might go up because of increased voice in politics and policymaking. And that complication essentially bears out in the trends that we see. So this figure is showing the number of members in the National Education Association and the AFT over the past 50 years. And what you can see, so this early period, this is the period that Mike was looking at, the times of collective bargaining expansion. So this is for NEA and this is for AFT. And what you see is that right at the same time that the profession is declining, remember the steep declines in the 1970s, collective bargaining is also increasing. So this is consistent with this idea that the broader state of labor relations might have lowered the prestige of the profession, with unions in this period in particular taking a more industrial unionism sort of approach for collective bargaining. But then since 2010 or so, we see the opposite. So the declines in the profession that occur at this time are occurring at the same time as stagnant or declining unionization rates. And it may not be a coincidence that the big declines in the state of the profession occur at the same time as new policies that are targeting teachers' unions and the accompanying rhetoric alongside these policies. So big picture, what we have is a profession at its lowest points in half a century, without one clear driving force. And so many people have said, okay, so what can we do? Well, one option might be to increase teacher voice in politics and policymaking. And how can we do that? So one way that teachers can try to drive policy narratives is to go on strike. And this is a particularly desperate way that is still relatively rare. So what you're seeing here is from original tracking of strike data from my research team. We found evidence of 772 teacher strikes since 2007 and 2008. This is a map showing the states where the strikes have occurred. Redder means more strikes, and the dates are showing you when coordinated strikes that were across districts took place. So by definition, there are multiple districts going on strike in those coordinated strikes. And you can sort of see the geographic clustering. But we're also really interested in understanding what the effects of these strikes are. And so in a new paper out very recently in the Journal of Human Resources, my colleague, again, Matt Kraft, and I examined how strikes might allow teachers to drive policy narratives. And so we argue and show evidence that teacher strikes publicly signal the need for political and economic change in public education. We are trying to broaden the conversation around unions, acknowledging that teachers are a large workforce of over 5.4 million Americans that are immensely important in ways that extend beyond their direct impacts for student achievement. So I was a 6th grade teacher before I got my PhD. And personally, I think teachers matter both for students and as middle-class workers in an increasingly unequal society. And so what we're doing is actually a very similar approach to what Mike talked about with the differences and differences. And so I'm not going to explain the approach too much and just show you the results. And so the first thing we look at is how do strikes affect the prevalence of education in political campaigns? And we find that strikes lead to dramatic increases in the prominence of education in campaigns. So moving education ads from the level of prominence of veterans ads in US House of Representative campaigns to the level of jobs ads. And this is strongest in the period closest to an election. So this is what I'm showing here, where teacher strikes are leading to a roughly 20 percentage point increase in the probability of airing an ad in the 2 months before an election in the area where the strike took place. And these are almost entirely concentrated in positive ads. We also examined whether that matters for education, politics, and policies downstream in a few different ways. Here I'm showing the effect of strikes on revenues to the left and on expenditures to the right. And what you see is that prior to the strike, there are no differences between striking and non-striking districts in terms of revenues and expenditures. But post-strike, the annual education revenues and expenditures increased by about $600 per student. There's a lot more in the paper and that we're working on in terms of the effects of strikes. So I'm certainly happy to answer more questions about this in the Q&A. But for now, 3 big takeaways. One is the teaching profession is at an all-time low. This is not just because of COVID, but there is still hope. We've been in a somewhat similar place before and came out of it in the 80s. And also strikes are mechanisms by which teachers, when they're very desperate, are able to drive policy narratives and signal the need for change. Strikes are still pretty rare, but they've been increasing overall, in part because of spurts in 2018 and 2019. And when they have occurred, they've increased the salience of education and politics and led to increased spending on education. So thank you, and I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Mimi. Now we'll turn things over to Kira.
Okay, this has been a really rich discussion so far. First of all, Paul, Michael, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of such a rich discussion, and thank you for the inclusion of TeachPlus's perspective in what is such a dynamic and important consequential conversation about the state of the profession and the role of unions in particular. I want to start with just a few kind of framing points about what TeachPlus exists to do. And Mimi, I'm struck in particular about your overall analysis and the macro trends you just shared. We share those too, and we hear those every day in our work with educators, just the overall sort of challenging state of affairs for the broader profession. And yet, I think similar to what I believe you were also sharing, I have a great deal of optimism because every day I have the opportunity to work with teachers and see teachers in action who, despite the challenges that the profession faces, are actually raising their hands to take on more leadership, not less. And actually saying that despite wanting to be classroom teachers, right, not wanting to go, become administrators necessarily or sort of leave the school building and go on, take on other pursuits in educational leadership, wanting to be classroom teachers and yet wanting to amplify their voice more consistently and have their voice have an opportunity to shape broader issues of importance for their students and really have their leadership be prioritized so that they have the capabilities to influence their peers and play critical roles at the school, district, and sometimes even systems level in actually shaping the direction of student learning in their classrooms. And so our mission is really based on that observation and belief that when teachers are given the opportunity to take leadership over critical issues that impact their students everywhere from the classroom to the State House to the Capitol, solutions are more sustainable and more enduring and actually more, able to actually be scaled when teachers are at the center. This seems like a really basic idea, but in fact, it is still today in 2024 quite revolutionary, right? Even, we are a 15-year-old organization and we've over the past 15 years been cultivating the leadership of teachers to play outsized roles in and beyond their classrooms. And yet I can tell you myself as a policymaker for the last 12 years in Louisiana, how often we would be shaping a major piece of policy or working with the legislature to shape major, laws that will impact ultimately how teachers teach and how students learn. And it's sort of an afterthought. How are we going to engage teachers? Oh, wait, let's go sell it to teachers now. versus teachers being actually woven into the decision-making process along the way and their perspectives actually being driven by that, right? This is a snapshot of our current footprint. We are present in 12 regional hubs and have a growing presence in our nation's capital as well. While every community is different and our work doesn't look exactly the same in every place, particularly because decision-making doesn't happen the same way in every place, and policy making and practice doesn't actually play out the same way in every place, there are a few features that you would actually see in common if you were working with TeachPlus fellows or working with TeachPlus change agents or engaging with our National Policy Advisory Board at the federal level. You would see policy fellowships where we actually teach teachers how to understand all of the aspects of policy making, right? How a bill becomes a law, how decision making occurs, how within a certain state funding is allocated, how certain policies have had a historic impact on the trajectory of student learning in that context. And we really do prioritize deep knowledge on the part of our teachers. We also help them understand the many tools for advocacy they have at their disposal to influence decision-making. Everything from how to write an op-ed, right, as a communications lever, to understanding the vital role that research plays and partnering with research institutions play in actually shaping the perspective of decision makers. And then we spend a lot of time helping them understand enough about their system to be at the table influencing decision makers on critical issues of importance. In a moment, I'll share with you a few examples of what that looks like, but that's sort of one domain, one set of features you actually see in many of the contexts in which we support teacher leaders across the country. The second would be a lot of the work we do around practice. So many of our teachers are seasoned educators in their classrooms, and many of them have played a role in policy making through our policy fellowships, but also want to have an outsized role in shaping successful implementation. Like we all know, I myself as a fourth grade teacher and a policymaker years later knows that you can have great policies, but if it breaks down in implementation, it's almost like, was it meaningful at all? So many of our teachers are very interested in building their own capabilities to influence successful implementation, right? So that can look like, for example, some of our practice work in Illinois that focuses on the Network for School Improvement, which is a partnership with Gates. We partner with, over 60 schools across Illinois to really help teachers, administrators, and district leaders actually sit at the table together and participate in like continuous improvement cycles, looking at data, particularly in this case around ninth grade on track measures, and in particular math outcomes for students, and really come to a set of solutions and insights around the data that are shared, right? And this might seem, again, quite simple, but the idea that teachers would actually be at the same table with principals and with district leaders to solve problems looking at the same data is actually quite, should be more common actually in this country than what we actually see. And then finally, we shape certain programs to provide particular counsel and advisory to decision makers, either at the school network level or sometimes even at the state level. State commissioners who often do want to engage teachers deeply and want unique perspectives on any number of issues that they're facing often don't have particular ways to do that efficiently. And so we partner with states, we partner with school systems and districts, sometimes networks of schools, to help them have formal teacher advisory cabinets, where we actually help teachers be able to sit at the table with decision makers and actually shape major strategy, major decisions that are actually made at that level in a way that actually helps teacher voice get really honed and accelerated. Just a quick couple of examples I could choose from many. As I said, we're present in over 12 states and nationally, but I wanted to choose one state example, one federal one, and a practice example, which I've already alluded to. This is just an example of our work in Mississippi. Mississippi in the last several years has had one of the most, I think, successful teacher pay increase campaigns in our country, at every level of that, from shaping the actual campaign to being voices, to writing op-eds, to giving testimonies. Our teachers were at the front lines of that, shaping that discussion and successfully leading to teacher pay raises. Most recently, they also, again, with the skills that they've developed over time, some of them going into their third, fourth, fifth years, sort of learning deeper and deeper understanding of policy and advocacy work, successfully able to pass, most recently, the school sort of funding reform that has happened in Mississippi, and I'm glad to speak more to that. Most recent example from our National Policy Advisory Board, which is a group of 12 teachers from all across the country who now are taking on a federal policy agenda, and most recently have met with over 59 lawmakers over a course of 2 days, advocating for robust funding for the teacher and school leader incentive grant, right? Which many people, who are even, close to this didn't realize was actually being cut by over 2/3, and that would affect over 100 US school districts. Our teachers were knowledgeable on the issue, lobbied congressional offices, sat down with U.S. Secretary, of Education Miguel Cardona at the end of the 2 days to share their reflections, both about the profession and also about this particular work that they've identified as being as incredibly important to their students' success and to their schools and districts. And so far they are, along with our support, sort of accelerating and making some significant progress on a very consequential bill. Just an example, I mentioned the Network for School Improvement on our practice domains, but these are just some of the results that are nascent but very promising. And I bring it up only because, I think about, Mimi, what you shared about the state of the profession, and many people are trying to solve the issue of teacher shortages through fancy marketing campaigns and thinking that the way we're going to solve this is just sort of getting out there and getting teachers to do this thing. Yes, maybe there are needs for better communication channels, but we actually think it also begins with a deep understanding of the ways in which the role needs to be set up to be successful, frankly, to begin with. And one of those important indicators are essentially how teachers feel about their own roles. And so these are just some of the metrics for how teachers have felt being engaged deeply in a process of continuous improvement to shape the broader conditions around their classrooms, and be able to sort of be a part of a decision-making process that ultimately impacts students. And not only
thank you very much, Kira. We're running short on time, so thank you very much for sharing all that.
Thank you.
So the first question that I would like to pose is to Michael. Mike, can you, I noticed that you saw some big effects on men, but not on women. And of course, this was the time when women were entering the workforce. And so things were happening out there that were changing that might have affected it. But do you have any thoughts as to why that is? And my second barrel of the two-barrel question is, how much is teacher seniority, the policies that work to the benefit of senior teachers, a part of what you think might be at work here?
Great, thanks for those questions. So first, the effects on women were surprising to us. We didn't come into it thinking that there'd be huge gender differences, although we did look separately by gender. So obviously we thought there could be something going on there. I mean, Paul, as you said, like this is a time period in so for the cohorts, born basically from the late 50s to the early 80s, this is a period of like rapid changes, particularly in female labor force participation, right, and increases. And so one of the things we argue in the paper is the design of this study is not great at being able to disentangle some of those broader effects on women because they're so enormous from the effects of these duty to bargain laws. And so we kind of downplay, how much we can really take away from the female estimates. We do find more consistent evidence of adverse effects on Black and Hispanic women. So, there's some suggestive evidence of this inequality still going on, but in general, the effects for women are just, they're just not very conclusive, I would say, because of this kind of broader issue. I think this also, to the extent that we are comfortable interpreting them as null impacts, this does align with actually this strand of literature of research in economics and broadly in the social sciences, showing that boys tend to be more affected by adverse shocks than girls. And so you know, if you can think of this as like something happening to the educational environment that might reduce its quality, you know, this actually does align with research about how boys and girls are kind of affected by adversity differently, you know. And so, you know, I'm not super surprised about the result given that, but I also just want to be honest about, you know, how difficult it is to disentangle these broader things going on with in particular female labor force participation and labor supply. Sorry, your second question was
about the importance of seniority.
Oh, the seniority, yeah. So we did not look much at this question. I mean, this is a really hard question to get at because you need detailed teacher level data going back to the 60s and 70s, which you really don't have. So we look a little bit at how these duty to bargain laws affect teacher or resource allocation. So what we see, and this is aligned with some other work that I've done and that other people have done, is more money is being spent on teachers. We don't see a big effect on teacher earnings or wages, but you see that more teachers are being hired, right? And so I think the implication there, which we don't look directly at, but is you know, if you read between the lines here, is that teacher seniority is declining, and I think that is going to happen naturally when you hire more people. So that could be part of it. Although, you know, you'd think that seniority piece would kind of over time would net out, and what you see is over time the effects get much larger. So, you know, I don't have a ton to say about seniority. I think it's an interesting component of this that, you know, should be looked at.
Mimi, I'd like to ask you, especially since you showed us such a long time horizon with some of your data, to maybe speak a bit to a trend that we've seen across the country with unions, whether it be in collective bargaining or strike campaigns. And that trend is toward what's been called common good bargaining. This idea that the union wants to play a role in negotiating or lobbying for things that maybe aren't what we think of as the bread and butter salary and benefits, but instead are broader political or community goods. And my question is this, like, setting aside your own views on whether the things that they're advocating for are desirable policies or not, can you maybe talk through what are the advantages and disadvantages for unions and obviously most essentially for teachers and students of that approach of unions going beyond sort of the contract as it was in the 60s and 70s around salary?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. And this is something that I've been interested in. I think and you're right to sort of disentangle the ethical dimensions of bargaining for the common good versus the strategic dimensions of bargaining for the common good. So I think a lot of what gets talked about is the sort of ethical dimension of that. But I think that the strategic dimension is equally as important and interesting too, that bargaining for the common good is perhaps by its nature an effort at expanding the scope of conflict. You know, the old Schnatzsteiner way of thinking about it. And it's possibly a mechanism for generating allies. And so I've written about and elsewhere about how teachers engage in a lot of coalition building work in order to develop allies, and that this is something that's particularly important in the context of a strike. So you might think that common good bargaining and common good demands would be especially prominent in the context of a strike, where teachers really do need to focus on how they're perceived by third parties, especially third parties that are affected by the strike, but may not have skin in the game. And so one of the things that we tracked when we were tracking strikes was whether or not they had common good provisions or whether there were common good demands associated with the strike. And this is just from news media reports of the strikes, but we were able to sort of figure out what the strike was about in all of the strikes that we were tracking. And common good demands were still pretty rare. So overall, about 1 of every 10 strikes, 11% of the 772 strikes had some kind of common good demand, whether it be expanding healthcare in schools, or it could be keeping ICE out of schools, or it could be related to broader housing issues that weren't even necessarily related to schools at all. And that these were especially prominent in coordinated strikes. So about 14% of coordinated strikes had these common good type demands that were not specifically about what we think about as everyday teaching and learning, or like bread and butter type issues of unionism, but about like broader societal issues that teachers may be bringing up in order to attract allies, or because it's something that they really do care about and they feel that like teachers unions are a mechanism for bringing that to light.
So Kira, I have a question about the impact of teacher unions on Black teachers. One of the things that we've learned is that a Black student will benefit if they have a teacher of the same racial background. And yet we also find that Black teachers are underrepresented in the labor force. Part of that is just due to the fact that you have fewer Black college graduates as a percentage of the population than you have in the elementary and high school. But there seems to be also some barriers to entering into the teaching profession that may artificially and make it more difficult for the teaching force to be representative. So you have any thoughts on the role of unions and the composition of the teaching force?
Well, I agree with your analysis about some of the barriers that have led to us, as a country not having as diverse a teacher base as we need, and the research that actually speaks specifically to the power of a student having, a teacher of color in their lives, or a Black teacher in particular. So those are true. Our teachers are, in many of the contexts in which we support them, taking on powerful efforts to address that and change that, both with their district, with district leaders who are also trying to solve those problems in places like Pennsylvania, and also more broadly, sort of setting a policy context to make the profession more attractive and address some of the barriers. I think specifically around, praxis exams and things that have historically correlated to sort of not necessarily leading to teachers of color, Black teachers in particular, being able to enter the profession. So we actually see the same thing that you just shared, and that is certainly an issue that across the country teachers are taking on and identifying. I think, again, when teachers are the messengers on an issue, right? I think there's still, even today in 2024, teachers are still incredibly, I think, credible messengers for issues like this and others. And so when teachers are sort of brought into the process and able to help shape the issue and shape the policy solutions or the engagement that's needed at a district level or a school level to advance some of these issues, like that is where we're going to find better solutions.
I also have a question for Kira, which is that, and for our audience, just for the context, TeachPlus is neither, I don't speak for you, but my understanding is certainly it's neither a pro-union or an anti-union group. It's its own thing. But my question goes to that, which is, so we had the Janus Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago, which a lot of people predicted would lead to a huge decline in the number of teachers who joined their unions. And we didn't really see that. We saw a decline. So that suggests that obviously many teachers out there still find their unions to be valuable. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the sort of complementary role that TeachPlus plays, and maybe some specific examples of, it's obviously appealing to some teachers to work through your organization, either in conjunction with their union or separately. So I'd love to hear from you about that.
Well, just thank you for that distinction. What I would just share is many of our teachers, TeachPlus, thousands of teachers who are in our fellowships or have, now are alumni of our programs. Many of them are really active in their unions, right? These are teachers who want to take on expanded leadership beyond the classroom, which means they are often looking for any number of ways to do that. And I think for many teachers find that unions create that opportunity, right, to be a building leader or to have a voice on a broader level. And so we find that a lot of our teachers are choosing, among many other ways, to join unions to sort of activate their leadership more broadly. And we think that's great. As it relates to our engagement, we build coalitions in contexts where we want to shape policy. And those coalitions are diverse by nature. And in many ways, depending on the issue, there are times where TeachPlus teachers in their formal capacity as being a part of TeachPlus are partnering with unions and partnering with other stakeholders to accomplish really important, important things, right? So we have lots of examples where we've partnered with unions to accomplish, important policy wins in places like Massachusetts and California and elsewhere. And we think that's great. And we also believe that the kind of skill development that teachers need to be able to deeply understand the issues, which is where this starts, right? Deeply understand the issues facing students, not just from their own lived experience, but because they understand the research, they understand the evidence base, and then understand the levers that would enable, successful influencing of decision makers is deep work. Like, it's deep work that isn't just about like sending a flyer to a teacher and saying, hey, can you show up here and sort of wear a t-shirt? Like, we really believe it's like deep capacity building work that leads teachers to actually see their own sense of agency and have an opportunity to shape the broader conversation, which is what we believe many more teachers want. And that there's just a lot more attention that could be spent on developing teacher leadership and voice in this country at scale.
Mimi, I have a question about your very interesting interest in entering the teaching profession, which has declined. And I'm wondering to what extent there are other forces in the labor market that could be a factor here. I know you have 17 different reasons and you couldn't cover all of them, but it struck me that there may be many other opportunities out there, and the opportunities in education may be declining. That is to say, fertility rates have fallen. For years and years and years, we were more and more children every year, every decade. Now that's peaked, and clearly the future doesn't look the same as the past. So how much is this just a rational response on the part of young people? This is not the right place for a career. I want to go into business, or I want to go into technology or some other kind of field, which is much more open to women today than in the past. And to what extent does that count for your findings?
Thanks. Yes, this is one of the hypotheses that we look at. I think it might actually be the first one that we look at. And there's been some really good economics research on the sort of opening up of labor market opportunities for women and how that's shaped teacher quality in the 1970s and early 80s. And so we dig into this a little bit more and also discuss and acknowledge the fact that as women were experiencing these like opening of labor market opportunities in the 70s and 80s, for the most part, Black women, but Black men too, were also being fired from teaching jobs because of the shutting down of Black schools in the process of attempting to desegregate. And so there are these kind of expansions and contractions that are happening simultaneously in the 70s that I think contribute to some of the declines in the profession that you see in the 70s in complicated ways. But this is, and we look into this more recently too, just exploratory again, the trends where we see sort of the starkest declines for women and for people of color in the 70s don't also happen in the most recent decline in the 2010s. So the declines in the 2010s we see happening across the board, whether you're a man or a woman. In some cases, the declines are actually looking even stronger for men, but essentially look pretty similar, and also across races look relatively similar more recently. So that's sort of in contrast to the declines in the 70s, which were more concentrated among white women and among Black men and women, but especially Black women.
Mike, you mentioned something in your presentation at the end on the policy implications that I thought was interesting, but I want to press you on a little more, which is the idea that maybe we can have our cake and eat it too. We can still have collective bargaining, but maybe limit the scope of it. Last week, our colleague here at Hoover, Tom D, presented really compellingly, I think, that the contract that Michelle Reed negotiated in DC around teacher evaluation, that impact program, did really good things for kids. And in fact, it did good things for many teachers as they were compensated much more lucratively. You know, I asked Michelle, do you think that you can include evaluation in a collective bargaining agreement and come out with that kind of a deal? So I just sort of want to put that to you and say, do you think when you're thinking of what would you take out of the scope of bargaining, Would evaluation? What else are you thinking there?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I mean, this actually aligns as well with some of the evidence from Wisconsin, which significantly limited the scope of collective bargaining. And really what it did was gave districts much more flexibility over setting wages. So Barbara Biasi has this great paper. She's a professor at Yale, has this great paper on this, showing that basically what happened was districts were able to better compensate more high performing teachers. You know, and that led to higher student achievement, right? And so this kind of very much aligns with the impact stuff that Tom D's done, which is also great work. Yeah, look, I think creating more flexibility is critical, and in particular, creating more flexibility to reward high quality teachers, right? I'm getting back to the discussion we just had. You know, one of the biggest issues is, you know, the U.S. labor market's really shifted over the past 50 years to reward you know, really high skilled labor, right? And so if you have the ability to be successful in business, in finance, you know, in tech, right, the returns to this in terms of your earnings are astronomical, right? And you know, teaching used to be this very high prestige, relatively high wage profession, and it just hasn't kept pace for a lot of reasons. I mean, no one's really suggesting that we pay, you know, teachers $500,000 a year, but that creates issues, right, around these, like, you know, if you have really good teachers who, you know, are high skilled and could earn a lot of money outside of the labor market, or outside of teaching in another part of the labor market, you know, they're just giving up a lot, right? And so the inability to be flexible with a lot of these teacher contracts, I think, is really harmful. And then also, you know, like, everyone likes to be recognized for their work, right? And if you're more productive and if you're adding more to your environment, you know, you should be compensated more. And the structure of current teacher labor markets and compensation does not really allow for that to happen, right? So I think, you know, there's a lot of barriers. There's nothing like per se about unions that wouldn't allow this to happen. I think a lot of it is, you know, from the perspective of teachers who are very much, my experience, and Kira, you might know more about this, talking more to teachers, but are very against the idea, you know, on the whole of this. And so the question is, you know, why are they so against the idea of paying people more when they're high performing, and linking performance to earnings? That's an issue. Like, as an economist, that's something that's like fundamental to how we think about how labor markets operate, right? And so, you know, I think there's a cultural issue with teaching that is against this, and that's holding things back. But I do think that that's kind of the key issue that needs to be resolved. It can be resolved within the context of the collective bargaining agreement, right? But you know, so far teachers have generally used their bargaining positions to generate compensation structures that don't allow for that.
All right, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer a great big question, each of you. And I'm going to start with Mimi. So Mimi, why has the interest in teaching declined and society's opinion fallen about educators? Have the educators invited this decline themselves? Are they responsible for the general decline in our enthusiasm for education in our society? Okay, 30 seconds.
So again, I mean, I think that there's no smoking gun for why the decline has happened. I think it's helpful to see trends over time. I think it's helpful to see that prestige declined in the 70s and came back up, and then has declined again since about 2010s, has not come back up. And so I think there are lessons that we can learn from the past about what might raise the status of the profession. If we just do eyeball tests on some of the different hypotheses that we've discussed, like I mentioned in the presentation, real wages seem to be really closely track on to the prestige of the profession. And right now we've had essentially stagnant or declining wages since 2008 for teachers. And so I think I don't think that that's definitively the silver bullet, certainly, but I think that's a place to look.
All right, Kira, 30 seconds.
The teaching profession has basically looks like it looked 100 years ago, right? Single teacher in the front of a classroom, in large part teaching 30 kids or more, right? And the world has changed, the needs of students have changed, teachers, this generation of teachers or would-be teachers have a whole different understanding and notion of their careers and of their roles. And we need to be thinking about how to reimagine and think more creatively about staffing structures and talent strategies that would actually make the job more effective and sustainable and lead more to I think a profession that teachers actually want. That's what I have.
Mike, 30 seconds.
I mean, I agree with what Amy just said. I mean, I just say, maybe reiterate it, which is to say, 100 years ago, the smartest people in our society became teachers, and now they don't. On the whole, I'm not casting aspersions on teachers, but if you look at the academic qualifications and backgrounds of people who select into teaching, it's very, very different. And aligns, as Mimi said, with the changes in prestige. And so, I think as an economist, I believe a lot of that's about how people are compensated. And so, I think that's a huge part of this. And so we need to think about, who's selecting into teaching, how that's affected by the wage structure, and what we might want to do about that from a policy perspective.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Mimi, and thank you, Kira. Thank you for an excellent presentation on the role of teacher representation and union participation in the collective bargaining process and its impact on the teaching profession. Next week, we're going to be turning to how should teachers be taught? Teacher preparation, very controversial topic at a time when education schools are under pressure and people are thinking about alternative ways about preparing teachers. We have an excellent panel on tap to discuss this. Peter Blair from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Heather Pesky from the National Council on Teacher Quality, and Dan Weisberg from the New York City school system. He's the first deputy chancellor of the New York City school system. All of these will be participating next week, June 6th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
This was wonderful. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.